you'll read a lot of scare stories. Now, I'm not underplaying what's happening. This is a revolution. It really is, but it's a necessary revolution. And I don't think it'll be as bad as people say. Certainly, it should be positive for the United States.
Hello and welcome to the Americano Show. We're going to be talking today about Liberation Day, which was yesterday. That is the day that Donald Trump went into the Rose Garden of the White House with his board, on which were listed various countries and the various tariffs that they charged against the US and the tariffs that Donald Trump, would impose on them in return. He said it's quite simple. What they do to us, we'll do to them. But is it that simple? Markets are it's not quite panic mode yet, but certainly sliding a bit this morning. And the anticipation of a trade war has got investors worried everywhere. To discuss this, I am delighted to be joined by William Clouston, who is leader of the British Social Democratic Party and something of a tariff advocate in Britain, which is quite rare. William, are you feeling liberated this morning from the tyranny of neoliberalism?
I am. Yes, I think it's a very exciting time, Freddie. I think many of us who've been arguing against free trade liberalism and free trade purism and looking at the industrial capacity of our countries and the extent to which that's been gutted and the extent to which that's harmed a lot of people, a lot of families, a lot of communities, are very excited about this. I think it's a necessary correction. If I were American, I'd be jumping with joy at this. I think it has union support, and a lot of people are very excited about it. I don't think it'll be easy. I think reindustrialization is a major challenge. Let's hope they haven't left it too late. But I think as a policy turn, it's absolutely necessary, and I support it.
But you're not American, obviously. You're British, like me. And it does look as though it could be, even though Britain is on this 10% rate, not the European 20% rate, it does look as though Britain could be in a bit of trouble, particularly with this 25% tariff on cars, which we export a lot of cars to America. And we've talked before about how the American and the British economies are very intertwined, so much so that we are in some ways a vassal state. Our economy is a vassal economy of America's. It's not looking good for us in the short term, is it?
It's not brilliant for auto exports, I agree. I think 25% tariff is not helpful at all to Jaguar and to Nissan and to the other UK domestic producers. But a 10% ad valorem tariff across the board, I'm not too concerned with. Every time anyone on our side of the argument, and there are precious few people in the UK that argue for tariffs and industrial protection, but every time we argue for it, people say, well, it'll be a disaster. But I always remind people that the currency, cable, the rate at which sterling trades with the US dollar fluctuates quite markedly. I mean, the last 3.5 years, the peak to trough difference, we're at 1.41 against the dollar, and down in the trust thing at sort of 1.1, which is a 27% difference. And if you're a UK exporter of a car or anything else, that is bigger than anything that's being proposed right now. And exporters have to deal with currency fluctuations just as now they're going to have to deal with a tariff. But I think it's interesting, Freddie. I mean, I think there are some favored nations in Trump world. And if you look at Australia and Singapore and Britain at 10%, we've actually done very well, and we should be very happy about that.
And of course, that is a benefit of Brexit, which the Labour Party are quite keen to talk about how Keir Starmer has his softly, gently approach has paid off. But it might actually be really to do with Brexit, which I'm rather less comfortable talking about.
I think that's probably true. It's one of these determined issues, and you don't know. Keir Starmer's trying his best. Obviously, I don't particularly rate him, but it may just be that Trump. I think Trump is clearly driven partly by sentiment and things, and I think he's partly Scots heritage and so on. He doesn't like the EU very much, and it may just be down to that. But whatever it is, it doesn't really concern me. I agree that the auto exporters from this country are going to have a harder time. But I think I would go back to the point. I always go back to the key point. The free trade purists who have allowed the US and the British economy to be gutted, to have these persistent large trade deficits which accumulate losses and degrade our capital account every year. They have no answer, Freddie, to correcting this. And I just don't think you can go on. I think it's going to be much harder for the UK, because I think the US is much more capable of being a decent autarky if it wanted, or semi-autarky, has much more power. But nevertheless, I don't think we can go on with the policies we've had. And I think it's a necessary historic correction against this sort of ideological, very naive free trade purism, which is not just the trade account, Freddie. It's the fact that you're not secure in a world where you've deindustrialized. I think Trump's speech was very interesting when he was talking about the capacity of the Americans, for instance, to build ships compared to China. And we've been literally gaslit for the last 40 years by these free trade purists to think that it's price. It's the cheap T-shirts. It's the cheap, cheapness trumps everything. Well, it doesn't. Sometimes national security trumps it. And I think Vance and Trump get that.
Well, I mean, do they though? Because it is quite hard to decipher what Trump's sort of bigger logic is sometimes, because I mean, he talked about them being reciprocal yesterday, and they're not exactly reciprocal. And of course, at some level, he seems to be entirely liberal about it. It's just he feels it's unfair. He would rather, it seems, have completely fair free trade and not have protectionism, or at least he sometimes seems to talk like that. J.D. Vance may talk differently. But the overall message of the Trump administration is not entirely coherent, I don't think.
Well, certainly I agree with you. It's not coherent. I mean, his first foray into this against Mexico and Canada, I think the attitude towards Canada was bizarre, and using tariffs as a sort of semi-transactional thing I think is quite foolish. If I was an American, what I want the administration to do is to set tariffs and keep them, and try and give some policy stability to industrialists and investors. I think that makes sense. But I don't actually buy. I mean, there's a large report being published, 180-page report, which provides some background to the logic of the non-tariff barriers that they're talking about, and the tariff barriers that Trump is responding to when he says reciprocal, and quite comically saying he's very generous. I don't really buy that, Freddie. I think if you look at it, the first little look at I had on trading economics was that roughly the magnitude of the Trump tariffs roughly match the size of the bilateral trade deficit they have with each country. So the Chinese, the Americans are running a goods deficit with the Chinese of about 350 billion a year. And they have the biggest, because he put 20% on before, and now there's another very large tariff going on. So I think that's what it is. And in a sense, I don't think it matters, because he's going to put them on. If he sticks to them, the policy should work in the long run.
But you think that Trump is right to just look at deficits in quite such a, I mean, it sometimes seems simplistic way, because these are very, very complicated things. And there's a row at the moment about how the Trump administration calculated what they think the tariffs against them are, and whether that's in any way accurate. I have no way of knowing. I'm not an expert about trade economics by any means. But the point is that it's not as simple as just looking at a deficit and saying, well, that means you charge a tariff of this.
I agree. It's not. And actually the external tariff applied by countries is not a simple predictor of what happens anyway. So 2 weeks ago I was in Seoul in South Korea, and Trump is right that if you look around the streets, 80-90% of the cars are made, and the buses and the trucks and everything else are made in South Korea. And Trump is moaning about that. But it's not just the tariff. If you look at the tariff, I mean, if an American manufacturer wants to break into the South Korean market, they can do so. But there are non-tariff barriers. I mean, people have reported, for instance, Freddie, that if a rich South Korean businessman were to buy a BMW or a Mercedes, they may get a tax inspection. That type of thing does go on. It goes on all over the place. And Trump, this is why I don't think it matters in a sense on the justification. If he sticks to his guns, I think you'll get a reordering of international trade. And you have to correct these imbalances. I would say what people need to realize is the imbalances and the deficits and the accumulated debt that countries like the United States and Britain are accumulating. You can't free trade your way out of that, I'm afraid. You can't. You've got to deal with it. And it's not in the interests of the world economy in the long run for these imbalances not to be corrected. They need to be corrected. So I say bring it on. I think it's a good move, and I hope he sticks to it.
Well, let's get on to that in a second. But one other thing I wanted to ask you about the sort of calculation of it is that I think on the sheet that they gave out and on the board that Trump was holding up, there was an asterisk. Yeah. And the asterisk said this includes currency manipulation.
Yes.
And I sometimes think, I don't understand the economics of this entirely, but I sometimes find the America complaining about that is a bit rich because, of course, they have the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So really they can do and have done what they want with the dollar, and that affects all of us, while complaining about other countries fiddling with their currency, which undoubtedly China does on a massive scale.
Yeah, well, Switzerland does, and the European Union does through the euro, which the euro is lower as a currency than the German D-mark would be, for instance. So all of this is going on. This is why I sort of chuckle to myself, having read on this topic for 15 years and argued about it for about as long. When people say you'll start a trade war, you're in a trade war every single hour of every day. You're already in a trade war. You know, the Chinese have been manipulating their currency in their own interests for a long time. I mean, on the dollar, the problem is on the upside, Freddie. So the dollar is too strong for many American manufacturers to export. I mean, it's not competitive. So, I mean, you know, yes, it helps American corporations acquire foreign assets sometimes, and banks and investment companies. It does. We've seen a lot of that. From Wall Street and private equity and so on. But it's not helpful for manufacturers. And this is the point. I always get back to it. You can look at trade in an entirely technical way as an economist if you like. But the reason that it gets back to political economy always is that the union workers and the United Auto Workers, Sean Fain, their leader, is absolutely in full support of this. And if you read the stuff he's put out and that union has put out, they make a very important point, which is, Trump's putting, quite heavy tariffs on auto imports, but you've got car plants all over the United States, not just in Michigan, but all over the United States that are under capacity, and you've got laid off workers. And if you give it long enough, my bet would be that those plants are repriced and American workers are going to benefit from it. So that's it. And the other technical thing that you might be interested in, people say, Trump's going to create a wave of inflation. And again, I disagree. Goods imports as a percentage of the US economy is about 11%. Now, if all of the tariff cost was passed straight through, you might have inflation might tick up by about 2.5%. But the point is, Freddie, it won't. And all of history proves that it won't, because none of these price changes will be passed straight through. Some of the price, if you're a cheese manufacturer in Devon, you're exporting cheese to the United States, some of the increase in the tariff will just be absorbed by you as a producer. Some of it will be absorbed by distributors and retailers in the United States. Not all of it will be passed through. So, you'll read a lot of scare stories. Now, I'm not underplaying what's happening. This is a revolution. It really is, but it's a necessary revolution. And I don't think it'll be as bad as people say. Certainly, it should be positive for the United States.
What you say about fighting a trade war every day makes sense to me. But there is also the concern about escalation.
Yeah.
And with China, that is a legitimate concern. And you could actually have a breakdown of the global economy, which may be a necessary thing, but it could be catastrophic.
No, I think there are risks there, and I'm not denying that. But as I say, there are risks in leaving a time bomb of accumulating huge deficits and costs as well. That's also a risk. If the wheel falls off the entire US economy and you get US fiscal deficits, for instance. So some economists are already saying that's going through an event horizon. You can't bring it back. That is very risky. So I'm not denying that. But I think overall, you've got to deal with these issues. And I would just say in terms of retaliation, I would predict, and you can mark this, and I think I'm pretty sure I'm right, that a lot of the retaliation will be symbolic. It's a bit like the European Union's retaliation on on motorcycles or particular agricultural products. They'll do that and they'll say they've retaliated. But you know what, Freddie? If you're a surplus country, you can't win a trade war by putting up tariffs against the person that's put up a tariff against you. You can't, just on the maths. So Trump has a lot of cards in his deck, and he's going to play them. And I wouldn't, there's not a lot China and the European Union can do. There's not a lot Britain can do about this. It's a reset, and the buying entity has the power.
You sound quite sanguine about the possibility of inflation in America and on American consumers. But part of Trump's plan, we don't quite know, is to carry on the tax cut and possibly even extend it or make the tax cut bigger. He's also talking about a Doge dividend, giving money to American taxpayers that they've saved from finding fraud and inefficiencies in the federal government. Could those things combined not create, with the tariffs, not create an inflationary spiral?
I don't think they'll create an inflationary spiral. I think inflation could tick up, and we saw that massively, at the end of COVID. So, that can happen. But if you look at the U.S. economy clinically now, if you just look at the data, very little of it is predicting a recession or an inflationary uptick. No, it isn't. Just isn't. All the key things that economists look at, heavy truck sales, and all, this is not indicating a recession. The Britain is close to a recession, and parts of Europe are close to a recession. The United States is. So again, we'll have to wait and see. I think some things people tend to think some corrections are bad, and I'm just saying that some of them are good. I mean, for instance, if there was a correction to the S&P 500, I think that would be a good thing. The S&P 500 is massively, massively overpriced, and it can't go on. So if you've got a run on that, I would say good. And if it settles down lower, good. That's something that won't have to be dealt with later. I mean, you raise the question of revenue, the federal budget generally. There is a slight. Certainly some of his advisors are very bullish on how much money they're going to get from imports, and from tariffs themselves. But the logic is doesn't really support them in that. I mean, if you correct your trade balance, you'll have fewer imports and you have less to tax. So all these claims about Navarro making claims that he's going to collect X tens of billions in, I don't know. I don't think that necessarily follows. If the policy works, logically you won't get quite as much. So we'll have to wait and see. But as I say, this is very exciting times in a way. Those of us that wanted trade protectionism and industrialization brought onto the agenda are jumping for joy. If I was American, I'd be very happy. I'm a little bit concerned. I think our politicians and our political class are behind the curve on this. And I've always argued that the first thing we need to realize is, and there is a turn here, is that protectionism and industrial policy is legitimate, and it's a tool that we should use.
I hear what you're saying about maybe the stock market does need to come down. Maybe it has been too high for too long. But one of the reasons why it is so high is because of large amounts of retail investing. And this is not rich people, just creaming money off the stock market. It's almost everyone. It's a large number of British people are connected to the stock market in some way through pensions or through their own investments. And in fact, I believe one of the reasons for the Great Depression in the 1930s was a sort of mania of retail investing, similar to the one we had during COVID. Yeah. Do you think that if that bubble bursts, I mean, I think it might not be a case of rebalancing, but upending?
Yeah, no, there's a wealth effect. I mean, if you get a serious correction, obviously sentiment changes, people's propensity to buy is reduced. So there is a wealth. I can't deny that will be, but you've got to ask yourself what the alternative is. I mean, the thing that's not helpful in the United States, I think it's practiced less here, but a lot of US retail investors borrow money to invest. I think it's very foolish. They shouldn't be doing that, and that's asking for a bubble in itself. But whether it happens in the next week or month or quarter or this year, the S&P 500 is massively overvalued. I don't think the British stock market, the FTSE 100 and 250 are actually. They're not too bad. So you might get some effect. You will have some effect if the S&P falls. But I'm afraid to say, I'm just saying it's It's an iron law. It's overvalued, so it will correct, I'm afraid.
Well, one way the Trump administration, I think, aimed to keep inflation down is energy, firing on all cylinders to make cheap energy. If you look at Britain, and if we are entering into a more protectionist era, an era where countries do need to onshore their own manufacturing and so on, with our current energy costs, we're just not going to be able to exist in that world, really, as an economic force.
I think it's you make a very serious point. I think we're in a real bind in Britain. The whole of the political class is net zero persuaded. They've been high time preference. No, since Blair onwards, right through the coalition, no serious long term planning has been undertaken. In fact, part of the problem, as I've always argued, is ideological, because the political class are all liberals of various kinds, and they can't bear to plan anything. They think it's just going to look after itself. But we are in a bind. I mean, for UK manufacturing is food and business to business higher end stuff. So all the consumer durables and a lot of the stuff, the bread and butter stuff, we just don't make, and unless we change the energy cost structure, we can't make. So I would want, we advocate as a party, the SDP, to roll out a British nuclear power sector again. We used to dominate this, but it's yet another thing that the political class have just let go. But you are in a bind. I mean, you can't. About half of our trade deficit is consumed in energy imports. It's absolutely mad. Do you know, Freddie, what the biggest single export from the United States to Britain is?
Is it gas?
Crude oil.
Oil. Yeah.
And that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. We have Rosebank and Shetland, and they're prevaricating. They just can't get their policy right. So I would just open that now. I mean, it seems mad to me to import crude oil and refine it and from the United States. But it does illustrate the point I'm making, which is that a country that's on receipt of a tariff war from the United States, what are we going to do? Put tariffs up on oil and increase our costs further? You're not going to do that. You're not going to. So you can't do a lot. A lot of it will just settle out. But I think we want to go. You need a government that takes these things seriously. One of the things that a British government could do, and it's non-tariff, but is just promote the idea of buying British and being, proudly buying British and supporting companies that are producing in this country and are British owned. That would be a start.
I saw a headline I thought you might find amusing about British Steel's Chinese owner has concerns. I think it was.
Yes. No, it's tragic, Freddie. It really is. I mean, it should never have been Chinese owned, just as Tata shouldn't have been allowed to own steel production in Port Talbot. And actually, Scunthorpe is a perfect example of the sort of degrading problem you have. I mean, they make all the railway lines, and if it closes, we've got, we're not the Indian Railways or Santa Fe in the United States, but we have a lot of rail track. And if that plant closes, we will be importing rail track from abroad. It's just absolute insanity. So I want I want the government to wake up and realize and get serious about industrial policy and protectionism. And it's, Trump and Vance have their boxing gloves on, and we should join them.
Well, you say you call it free market purism, and it does seem to have been almost a sort of religious belief about the power of markets to do great things. I mean, it stems from the fact that markets do have this power. Markets are extraordinary things that can change the world and lift people out of poverty. Do you think, are we not in danger of turning against actual capitalism itself, which is not necessarily the root of these evils?
No, I take the point. I mean, I was on any trade debate, I always open up and acknowledge the benefits to international trade, and they're absolutely considerable. This country can't produce oranges, you've got to import them, and there are advantages. International trade has spread wealth, increased production. And one thing I'll never argue about is that, WTO style free trade does make goods cheaper. It really does. But my argument is that puts the interests of the consumer above the interests of the domestic producer. And if you just don't have an eye on that, if you just let it go, then the cheapest producers, often using slave labor and often not adhering to any environmental standards, will just take the palm. And I think the biggest one that you can look at right now, is Chinese electric vehicles. They produce tens of millions of them domestically a year. They have practices that we wouldn't allow in this country. They have a massive price advantage. Now, I'll just say it. They've got a price advantage of about a third in all markets: Australia, United States, Europe, and here. So if you sit down and it's hello birds, hello sky, everything will be fine, you will not have a domestic car industry. That's just reality. I'm afraid the Chinese would have it all. So on something like this, I'm not arguing that it hasn't, international trade and production specialization hasn't increased production. It has. But if you're totally naive about it, it will hurt your country, and you'll end up a sort of beggar state. And that happens. So there has to be a quantum, and you have to have your eye on what is happening in a bigger scale. So that's all I'm arguing for. I'm very pro market. I'm very pro international trade, but not to a crazy extent. You have to look at what's in the national interest.
William Clouston, thank you very much. You are a lonely pro-tariff voice on the British political scene, but you're a very eloquent one, and I'm grateful to you for coming on.
Thank you very much, Freddie. Take care. Cheers.